On April 28, 1964, one day after celebrating the third anniversary of Sierra Leone's independence, the country's first Prime Minister, Sir Milton Margai, who never enjoyed robust health, passed away peacefully. The next day, on April 29th, despite some doubts about the constitutionality of his course of action, the first native Governor-General, Sir Henry Lightfoot Boston, swore the deceased Prime Minister's brother and Finance Minister, Sir Albert Margai, into office as the country's second Prime Minister. Albert Margai was born on October 10, 1910 in Gbambatoke in the Banta Chiefdom of Moyamba District in southern Sierra Leone. He was the younger brother of Sir Milton Margai, who was born in 1895 and who would eventually become the country's first Prime Minister when the country achieved its independence from Britain in 1961. Albert Margai was educated at the St. Edward's Secondary School in the capital Freetown, where he went on to be one of the first group of students. From there, he first worked as a nurse from 1931 to 1944 and qualified as a druggist. He then proceeded to Britain to study, where he qualified as a lawyer in 1948, thereby becoming the first British-trained lawyer hailing from the provinces, then known as the Protectorate. He returned home immediately and set up a fairly successful private legal practice, while at the same time participating in the politics of the day. Albert Margai was large in stature. He was a great orator. He was articulate and he spoke loud and clear, and sometimes he spoke a bit too much, almost bordering on becoming pompous and pedantic. His rhetorical prowess was remarkable, but some have said that there was often not much substance in the rhetoric. In this respect, he was a marked contrast to his brother Milton Margai, although he, Albert Margai, was admired for his rhetorical prowess, especially by the young people to whose youthful vanity this type of leader appealed. Immediately upon returning home from his studies in Britain in 1948, he joined the Sierra Leone Organization Society (SOS), a conservative group that was formed in 1946 by local Sierra Leoneans who advocated a unified Sierra Leone with self-government within the British Commonwealth. He entered the Protectorate Assembly in 1950, when he was elected to represent Moyamba in the Protectorate Assembly. Albert Margai played an active role in the debates over the Stevenson Constitution, a new constitution that was proposed in 1947 by the British colonial administrator, Governor Sir Hubert Stevenson, which for the first time gave the Protectorate an equitable share of representation in the Legislative Council. Also, he was one of the chief spokesmen for Protectorate interests. Meanwhile, the Sierra Leone Organization Society (SOS), together with two other groups, the People's Party (PP) and the Protectorate Educational Progressive Union (PEPU), merged in April 1951 to form the Sierra Leone People's Party (SLPP), with Milton Margai, the elder brother of Albert Margai, as its leader, and paramount chief, Bai Faramatas II of Cambia District, as its deputy leader. Although the SLPP motto, "One Country, One People," and its manifestos proclaimed it to be national party, transcending regional and tribal divisions, and although it had some members of the Creole ethnic group in its ranks, it was nonetheless a challenge to the Creole domination of Sierra Leonean politics. Most of the new party's leadership was drawn from the descendants of traditional ruling families in the provinces, then known as the Protectorate. In November 1951, general elections were held in Sierra Leone, which were won by the SLPP, and Albert Margai was elected to the Legislative Council as the first Protectorate member. That same year, a new constitution was declared by Governor Stevenson's successor, Governor Beresford Stuke, a major steps towards self-governance, as the constitution increased the paramount chief's representation in the Legislative Assembly to 12, one for each district, a practice that prevails today. The 1951 Constitution allowed for the retention of British colonial institutions, such as the governorship and the civil service. This meant that the country was still governed by British officials and was not fully independent. However, the Constitution provided the framework for decolonization. The Constitution allowed the colonial administration for the first time appointed a cabinet full of African ministers. In 1952, Albert Margai was appointed Sierra Leone's first Minister of Education and Local Government in his brother's cabinet, and during the 1957 parliamentary elections, which were won by the SLPP, he was elected to the House of Representatives for Moyamba South constituency. During this time, partly because of his youthfulness and nationalism, He had become an idol of many younger elements who were disgruntled with the conservative gradualism of his older brother. Shortly after the elections, he challenged his elder brother for the leadership of the SLPP in 1958 and was elected leader of the SLPP before party elders prevailed upon him to stand down in favor of his elder brother. Following the struggle for the leadership of the SLPP in 1958 with his elder brother, Milton Margai, resulting in his stepping down, Albert Margai subsequently rejected the offer of a cabinet portfolio under the leadership of his elder brother and went into the opposition, forming the People's National Party, PNP, together with Siaka Stevens, a prominent trade unionist, and other younger members of the SLPP, with himself as leader of the PNP and Siaka Stevens as Deputy and Secretary General. A major point of contention between the two groups involved the degree of involvement of traditional chiefs and traditional rules in the modern state. In fact, Albert Margai openly asked traditional rulers to stay out of politics. Towards the end of 1959, the leader of the SLPP, Milton Margai, formed the United National Front, a coalition of all registered functional political parties in the country, in order to negotiate with the British government for the independence of Sierra Leone. In April and May 1960, Albert Margai, as leader of the PNP, and his deputy Siaka Stevens were part of a 24-member delegation that was led by Milton Margai at constitutional talks that were held in London with the government of Queen Elizabeth II to hammer out the terms under which Sierra Leone would achieve independence. On the question of defense, the conference report stated that Her Majesty's government and the Sierra Leone government had agreed that a defense agreement providing for mutual cooperation in the field of defense should be negotiated to be signed after independence. The deputy leader and secretary general of the PNP, Siaka Stevens, refused to sign the conference report because he was unable to agree on various matters, including defense and the holding of general elections before independence. He demanded that the electorate be given a chance to make its views known before independence. On his return to Sierra Leone, Siaka Stevens launched the Elections Before Independence movement, EBIM, which was soon transformed into a political party, the All People's Congress, APC, with himself as leader. The new party, comprising a much younger generation, especially the urban unemployed and discontented, lacking strong links with traditional ruling families, had its base in Freetown and the Northern Province. The APC quickly outflanked all other opposition parties in the country, leading the PNP to fall back into the ruling SLPP. The London Conference concluded on May 4, 1960, with the agreement that April 27, 1961, would be the date fixed for the independence of Sierra Leone. The APC led a campaign calling for elections before independence, but was overruled by the government. After the formation of the United National Front, which negotiated Sierra Leone's independence terms in London in 1960, Albert Margai reconciled with his brother and returned to the SLPP and was brought back into the government and was appointed Minister of Agriculture and Natural Resources. Sierra Leone achieved its independence from Britain on April 27, 1961, with Milton Margai as its first Prime Minister. In May 1962, Sierra Leone held its first general election as an independent nation, and the SLPP won plurality of seats in parliament, and Milton Margai was re-elected as Prime Minister. Albert Margai was re-elected to the House of Representatives for Moyamba South constituency and was appointed Minister of Finance. Albert Margai, as a minister, was brilliant and efficient. In every position he found himself or office he held, he earned for himself a reputation for hard work. His good organizing ability was noticed, and he was regarded as a man who got things done quickly and efficiently. A few examples of the manifestation of this quality in him can be given here. He had, before 1960, been Minister of Education and Local Government. In that position, he saw to the promotion and expansion of primary and secondary education nationwide, and gave opportunities by way of the award of scholarships to deserving students to study at Fora Bay College or universities abroad as appropriate. As Minister of Agriculture and Natural Resources, Albert Margai encouraged the establishment of agricultural plantations, thereby creating jobs for rural men and women. The women too had their own share of work on those plantations, from which they earned wages. This in itself was an innovation and a welcome development. As Minister of Finance, he presided over the establishment of the Central Bank, Bank of Sierra Leone, and the introduction of the leone as the national currency of Sierra Leone, and also the Sierra Leone State Lottery. On April 28, 1964, one day after celebrating the third anniversary of Sierra Leone's independence, the country's first prime minister, the elder brother of Albert Margai, Sir Milton Margai, who never enjoyed robust health, passed away peacefully. Sir Milton Margai died without naming a successor, even if he had one in mind. There was then no constitutional provision for the automatic succession by any of the surviving office holders in the party or in the government, unlike what obtains today. Since there was no constitutional provision for a deputy prime minister, a vacuum was created for the highest position in the land. This was when things began to go awry, as there was a frantic jostling for this leadership position. At the forefront for the premiership race were Dr. John Karefa Smart, a northerner and physician who served as the country's first foreign minister, Alhaji Mohammed Sanusi Mustafa, a Creole and a minister who usually acted as prime minister during the incumbent's absence, and Albert Margai, who at the time was Minister of Finance. At the time, there was a widespread feeling that the opportunity should be given to a northerner to lead the country, since the deceased prime minister was from the southern part of the country. The governing constitutional provision for the appointment of a prime minister was then contained in the 1961 Independence Constitution. It made no constitutional provision for the automatic succession by any of the surviving office holders in the party or in the government. It placed on the Governor-General the sole responsibility for that appointment. The relevant provision was itself as unclear as it was subjective. It gave the Governor-General the power to appoint as Prime Minister a member of the House of Representatives, who, in his opinion, was likely to command the support of the majority of the members of the House, and in the exercise of this power, the Governor-General shall act in accordance with his own deliberate judgment. This was a controversial clause. Albert Margai was appointed Sierra Leone's second prime minister under that provision. By that appointment, the course of Sierra Leone's history was changed for the worse, and its decline started, and it had continued in that direction in an aggravated form ever since. This appointment did not sit well with some senior members of the SLPP who protested. Many of those who opposed his appointment on the assumption that it was unconstitutional for him to succeed his elder brother were northerners. Albert Margai's leadership was briefly challenged by Foreign Minister John Karefa Smart and 3 others, who questioned Albert Margai's succession to the SLPP leadership position. The 4 ministers were senior and long-standing members of the cabinet of the deceased Prime Minister Milton Margai, whom they had served loyally and faithfully throughout his tenure of office as Prime Minister. They were also highly respected in the SLPP and very prominent and influential in their respective areas of origin where they commanded a large following. The 4 ministers were Dr. John Karefa Smart, a highly educated and respected national figure hailing from Tonkolili district, M.S. Mustafa, a prominent Aku Creole from the western area, Y.D. Sisai, of Temne Loco descent, a former vice principal of Bo School. He was highly respected nationwide, especially in Bombali district, and S.L. Maturi, the only prominent Kono member of the former cabinet of Milton Margai. John Karefa Smart led a prominent small minority faction within the SLPP party in opposition of Albert Margai as Prime Minister. However, John Karefa Smart failed to receive broad support within the SLPP in his attempt to oust Albert Margai as both the leader of the SLPP and Prime Minister, as the large majority of SLPP members backed Albert Margai over John Karefa Smart. The appointment of Albert Margai as Prime Minister ushered in a new era in the political dispensation of Sierra Leone. He was quite a different personality from his brother Milton Margai, with radical, acquisitive, robust, and an imposing personality tending towards dictatorship. Where Milton Margai would tread softly, especially in sensitive and difficult situations, Albert Margai would use the iron fist, which fueled some resentment against him. These personality traits led to his downfall in later years as he ran the SLPP aground. Soon after he was sworn in as Prime Minister, Albert Margai took offense over the stance taken by John Karefa Smart and others, and his reaction was to dismiss them from the government. This dismissal set the stage for the North-South divide and enduring resentment between the 2 dominant ethnic groups, the Temne and the Mendi. In particular, the dismissal of John Karefa Smart, the most prominent northerner in the cabinet, intensified the ethnic and regional tensions, leading more northerners to swell the opposition APC's ranks. The dismissal of these men turned out to be a serious political blunder on the part of Albert Margai. It haunted him throughout his premiership and the SLPP in general. It caused considerable dissatisfaction within the SLPP itself and did not augur well for the new leader. It had the potential of undermining the unity and cohesion of the nation, the two elements which had been proved to be essential to the peace and development of the country, and to the avoidance of ethnic rivalry and even hatred. Albert Margai's reaction, which was swift and which was the first negative act he performed as Prime Minister without averting his mind to the possible consequences, showed his real color as a man who did not concern himself about the cohesion of his party or of the national unity which his elder brother, Sir Milton Margai, had embraced throughout his premiership. At a stroke, Albert Margai had taken measures to reverse all that. He was now conscious of his power as Prime Minister, and he preferred to use that power against those who opposed him or those he disliked. At the very commencement of his premiership, Albert Margai, by that reaction, had shown that he lacked that leadership quality of preferring persuasion, reconciliation and compromise to revenge, vindictiveness and the excessive use of power. It was then not necessary to be a prophet to know that the humiliation of those prominent politicians would certainly have adversely affected the standing of the SLPP in the northern region and in the Kono district and the unity and cohesion of the country, an essential ingredient in maintaining the peace and stability of the country. By that singular act, Albert Margai became the first person who constituted a turning point in the delicate democratic process and progress Sierra Leone had embarked on under Sir Milton Margai. He was not particularly keen to promote national cohesion, but only to enhance his grip on power. Thus, he started to rekindle the now forgotten North and South and mend the Themne political divide and rivalry. That rivalry has unfortunately persisted ever since, and it has always manifested itself in different forms, especially in times of political contests. The pressure from the reinvigorated opposition induced Albert Margai to resort to increasingly authoritarian tactics to consolidate his power. He demonstrated a highly undemocratic, autocratic, an abuse of power and a clear manifestation of bad governance, and which in the main hastened his downfall and with that the downfall of the SLPP. He enacted a number of bad laws. He introduced a form of tyranny in the politics and governance of Sierra Leone by means of the bad laws enacted to his discredit. This contributed to his eventual downfall. Albert Margai, on assuming the premiership, was knighted by the Queen of England, thus receiving the title Sir. He was indeed a popular leader initially, but for his greed for power and uncompromising nature, he had the opportunity to have maintained his popularity, in which case the course of Sierra Leone's history could have been different. He was bringing change and freshness into the politics of the country, and with this, prosperity, so it seemed. He spoke in terms similar to President Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana, who was at the time admired and who fascinated most Sierra Leoneans. He tried to give the image of a mass political party to the SLPP by encouraging the holding of mass political meetings, at which he spoke eloquently, giving hope to the people and promising them better days ahead. That was his own way of changing the image of the party from being regarded as an elitist party to a populist party. In the early days of his regime, Albert Margai was acclaimed as a man of change, a strong and progressive man, a solid rock on which the people of Sierra Leone were to lean for their prosperity and development. He organized prominent women in different parts of the country, conferring on them the title of Mammy Queens. Their role was to organize and consolidate the SLPP in their respective areas. Albert Margai, being the radical that he was, began his stewardship by mobilizing young educated individuals into the party. One such individual was Salia Jusu Sheriff, who later on played an important role in the country's development. It was thought that Albert Margai resented the power and influence that the traditional leaders, the chiefs, had over the decision-making process. He wanted to move away from the policy of conservatism to one of radicalism. In this, he looked towards Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana, the liberator that brought independence to Ghana in 1957. In foreign affairs, he took a militant stand on colonialism, in line with such radicals as Sékou Touré of Guinea and Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana. Whereas the deceased Sir Milton Margai had been less enthusiastic in signing agreements with the Guinean leader, Sékou Touré, Albert Margai, soon after taking office, entered into a series of accords with Sékou Touré, on economic, social, and cultural matters. Like that radical statesman, he called upon Britain to use force to quell the Rhodesian, now Zimbabwe, unilateral declaration of independence. He announced that Sierra Leone would seek economic aid from both the Eastern and Western Bloc. In a significant move in December 1965, he succeeded in securing aid for agricultural development from the Soviet Union to the tune of €1 million. A move to promote inter-African trade was evident in efforts to set up a free trade area between Guinea, Ivory Coast, Liberia, and Sierra Leone. Albert Margai's stance on international issues, especially the issue of Pan-Africanism, and his eloquence and contribution at international conferences, especially at the OAU or non-aligned or Commonwealth conferences, earned him international prestige and reputation to the extent that back home he was referred to as Albert Margai of Africa. He took a lively interest in the organization of African unity. Within 2 years of taking office, Sierra Leone's image in the international arena became brighter, and newspapers and other publications at home hailed Albert Margai of Africa. The Ministry of Information even published a pamphlet in his honor, with that title and detailing in the superlatives his performance at those conferences. He became the pride of Sierra Leone. He appeared to have relished those praises poured on him. Sierra Leone would have benefited considerably from the qualities Albert Margai possessed if he had genuinely articulated those qualities in the national interest and not just for his own self-interest or self-aggrandizement. The honors earned by Albert Margai for his performance abroad and the attempt to change the image of the SLPP were marred by his domestic policies. Before he was 1 year in office as Prime Minister, he committed a number of damning political blunders and took a number of undemocratic measures in very crucial matters. It became clear that he did not have a democratic personality, that he was not a man committed to good governance, and that he would not tolerate dissent, but would, with draconian laws and harsh measures, attempt to suppress any dissent to his administration and policies. He became known as a man prone to the excessive display of his own power and as being acquisitive and greedy for personal material wealth. When he became Prime Minister, Albert Margai was worried about the popularity of the APC in the municipality of Freetown. In a bid to shore up his dwindling popularity in the country and stifle the opposition, he advanced and legislated a series of measures which to all intent and purposes backfired. He decided to dilute the support of the APC by enacting legislation, which would result in reversing the proportion of seats held by the APC as against the SLPP share of the council's seats. The device he adopted to achieve this was to have the Freetown Municipality Amendment Act of 1964 enacted with provisions for the enlargement of the council and the changing of the tenure of office of the councillors. This device turned out to be a miscalculation on Albert Margai's part, as in the ensuing municipal elections of that year, the APC increased its share of the number of seats at the expense of the SLPP, with the opposition leader, Siaka Stevens, being elected mayor of the city. This was a significant rebuff for Albert Margai, as it clearly showed that the municipality of Freetown was firmly in the grip of the APC. Faced with the prospect of a further erosion of his party's standing in the country, Albert Margai launched a major offensive against the opposition. By May 1965, he was quoted as saying that he would pulverize the opposition. Albert Margai left no stone unturned in his effort to discomfiture the APC and stifle the opposition. While addressing a cross-section of the members of the judiciary during a courtesy call on him not long after his appointment as Prime Minister in April 1964, Albert Margai firmly assured the lawyers that he would not introduce a one-party form of government in Sierra Leone, but that he favored a multi-party system with an active opposition party. He promised to quit politics if the country lacked an organized opposition party. By December 1965, he had made a U-turn and put in motion the process to transform Sierra Leone into a one-party state. The first bill to give effect to this was passed in December 1965, and to make it become law, it then only required the passing of the same bill by the same two-thirds majority of the next House of Representatives as provided by the entrenched clauses in the 1961 Independence Constitution. Opposition leader Siaka Stevens condemned the passage of that bill, but did not vote against it. He only abstained, thereby leaving a room for him to use it at his own appropriate time to make Sierra Leone a one-party state. After the passage of that bill, Albert Margai set up a committee to collate information and views on the introduction of a one-party system and on the form it was to take. It was then that Siaka Stevens and the APC took legal proceedings to challenge the propriety of establishing that committee. The matter was discontinued without a decision taken. Meanwhile, there was a huge surge of opposition by the legal profession, university students and prominent civic leaders and opinion formers against the intended introduction of a one-party state and against the setting up of a committee for that purpose. The opposition was so determined and unyielding that Albert Margai again had to capitulate. Albert Margai's declared intention to maintain an active opposition soon after taking office was questionable. His real intention, allegedly, was to eliminate the strong stumbling block that was the APC. In continuing with his war against the opposition, a Public Order Act was enacted in 1965. The Public Order Act authorized the preventive detention of persons who threatened the vaguely defined public order. This was an act to consolidate and amend the law relating to public order. In a nutshell, it sets forth penalties for persons breaching the public order and includes such offenses as public insult, intimidation, throwing of missiles, idle and disorderly persons, rogues and vagabonds, drunkenness, beating of drums, riotous conduct, street noises, and trespass. Prohibits carrying of offensive weapons, regulates processions and public meetings, sets forth provisions regarding defamation and seditious libel and public emergencies. In spite of many brushes with the libel laws, the editors of the APC publication We Yon newspaper criticized Albert Margai's rule, which was depicted as the heyday of corruption and tyranny. Albert Margai was portrayed in the We Yon newspaper as a rabid tribalist who sought Mende domination of all spheres of the country. The opposition referred to the SLPP as a Mende political organization, whilst Albert Margai described the APC as a Temne Creole axis which would cut the Mende man's throat if it ever came to power. In 1966, 4 APC parliamentarians were serving jail terms of 12 months on trumped-up charges for riot and assault in connection with a by-election. To curtail the number of APC parliamentarians, the absenteeism law, another draconian law, was passed in 1966. It provided for the exclusion from the House of Representatives of persons who absented themselves from the sittings of the House for up to a period of 30 days. This law was deliberately aimed at the 4 APC members, who were in detention on trumped-up charges and therefore could not help being absent from the sittings of the House. The absenteeism law was accordingly invoked against them. Although the APC opposed the motion vehemently, it was carried. Subsequently, the 4 APC members who were serving jail sentences lost their seats. Albert Margai was accused of corruption and of a policy of affirmative action in favor of the Mende tribe. During his administration, the ethnic gap in the armed forces and in the civil service began to widen. He appointed many well-educated Mende to important civil service positions. His appointment of Mende civil servants to man key positions alarmed the Creoles, who felt that the civil service was their preserve. Even though some of the Mende appointed to the key civil service posts were qualified, and among the ablest in the service, the Creoles felt threatened, and they embraced the APC which, in the event of success in the general election, would turn to them for advice on civil service matters. As a result, Albert Margai became unpopular within the Creole community, many of whom had supported his elder brother, Sir Milton Margai. Under the leadership of Albert Margai, the proportion of Mende officers in army increased from 26% of the African officers in mid-1964 to 52% by mid-1967. Of the 17 cadets who graduated from the Bengema Military Academy in April 1967, 13 belonged to the Mende ethnic group. Faced with mounting challenges, Albert Margai followed in the footsteps of all too many post-colonial African rulers and brought the Sierra Leone army into politics for the first time. When the last British Army commander of Sierra Leone, Brigadier Blackie, was about to step down as force commander in 1964, an army officer, John Amadou Bangura, Sierra Leone's first Sandhurst graduate and the 27th West African to be commissioned in the West African Frontier Force, was recommended to replace the departing British general officer commanding. But Albert Margai appointed Lieutenant Colonel David Lansana, his brother-in-law and a Mende by tribe, to succeed Brigadier Blackie as force commander. Lieutenant Colonel David Lansana became acting force commander in 1964 and was promoted to full colonel, and in January 1965 he was elevated to the rank of brigadier and confirmed in his new position as force commander, replacing the British Brigadier Blackie, who became an advisor to the new head of the army. John Amadou Bangura was made deputy force commander. However, as Deputy Force Commander John Amadou Bangura was highly isolated and distrusted. He was increasingly watched as he was considered to have strong links with the opposition APC because he was from the northern part of the country, the APC stronghold. Suddenly, as a result of several developments, John Amadou Bangura began to be feared as the rallying point for any body of armed men who were disposed to upset the SLPP government. So great was Albert Margai's fear of a coup d'etat occurring in his absence that he took the Deputy Force Commander John Amadou Bangura with him to the 1966 Commonwealth Prime Ministers' Conference in London to act as his aide-de-camp. With his succession as Prime Minister in April 1964, the army came to enjoy an unprecedented prominence in national affairs. Albert Margai saw the enhanced role of the military as part of his campaign to abandon the cautious policy of his late brother. 2 months after taking office, Albert Margai attended the SLPP convention in the northern provincial capital of Makeni, together with David Lansana, then acting force commander, and William Lee, the commissioner of police. This bold step in getting David Lansana involved in public affairs coincided with Albert Margai's desire to portray himself as a dynamic leader bent on giving Sierra Leone a facelift. In his domestic policy, Albert Margai sought to strengthen the SLPP's hold on the country's political life. Where the army was concerned, Albert Margai's invitation to David Lansana to attend the SLPP convention at Makeni saw the beginning of close ties between the political leadership and the military's top man. Soon, photographs of David Lansana and Albert Margai at social gatherings and elsewhere began to appear in the local newspapers. In February 1965, the force commander, Brigadier David Lansana, was leader of the OAU Defense Commission meeting in Freetown. 2 months later, he was in Israel attending the Independence Day celebrations. He was also part of an OAU commission sent to the Portuguese colony of Guinea-Bissau to ascertain the strength of the liberation movement there. In January 1966, he attended an OAU Defense Commission meeting in Accra, Ghana. His favored position with Albert Margai gave him a strong sense of security, while Albert Margai no doubt felt that he was a strong insurance against any untoward event. In June 1966, when Albert Margai went on a visit to areas in the southern and eastern provinces which had returned SLPP candidates in the district council election, he was accompanied by Brigadier David Lansana. Albert Margai was accused of siphoning a lot of public funds into overseas foreign accounts held by members of his family on his behalf. As his motorcade moved along, verbal insults were heaped on him and he was called by derogatory names, one of which was Akata, meaning a thief. In the months immediately preceding the 1967 election, the APC, through the Wiyon newspaper, sought to discredit Albert Margai largely on account of his alleged involvement in financial corruption. The opposition disclosed in August 1966 that Albert Margai owned substantial property locally and abroad. His houses in Washington and London were let to the Sierra Leone diplomatic missions in these cities. A later commission of inquiry known as the Forster Commission of Inquiry, that was set up after the fall of his government, established that Albert Margai's assets amounted to 200,000 euros, when his official salary for the period of his rule was less than 20,000 euros. Besides using his office for personal gain, Albert Margai was constantly criticized for turning a blind eye to the corrupt financial practices of some highly placed persons. The foreign reserves of the country dwindled, and the produce exporting institution, the Sierra Leone Produce Marketing Board, could not meet its obligations to cash crop farmers. The main reason, however, was that the board spent huge sums of money establishing agricultural plantations in the country. In November 1966, the International Monetary Fund provided a loan of $7.5 million to help the country improve its balance of payments and financial position. In the same month, opposition leader Siaka Stevens issued a criminal summons against Albert Margai, who had imported a Cadillac limousine without paying custom duties. However, Siaka Stevens himself later used the car when he became leader of the country. Critics of the SLPP regime and its corrupt practices, galled by the deteriorating economic situation, began to prescribe drastic solutions to the country's economic difficulties. One of them urged the Governor-General to give serious thought to the situation, declaring that he must not just stay put until the national kitty is absolutely bare, and suggested that maybe the wisest thing to do in the circumstance is to suspend the constitution and ask the army to take over. A few months after this article appeared in the Wiyon newspaper, of October 22, 1966, The writer, Raymond Sarif Esman, was named as one of those who incited the military to overthrow the regime. In 1966, talks of transforming Sierra Leone into a republic began making the rounds. One of the earliest indications of this proposed change was given by the SLPP newspaper, Unity newspaper, in June 1966. The details of the draft bill were not made public until late December 1966, when the government introduced a draft constitution calling for a transition from a constitutional monarchy to a republican form of government with a ceremonial president. The 1961 Independence Constitution provided for such a change in the country's fundamental law, but the bill had to be passed by a two-thirds majority, followed by a general election, and then by another two-thirds majority in the new House. The bill was passed in January 1967. The APC opposed the bill, describing it as dictatorial as, according to the APC, the bill had been passed without proper consultation. After the Republican bill was passed in January 1967, Sierra Leoneans began to prepare for the second general election since independence. The APC manifesto for that election expressly stated that, if it won the election, it would reject the Republican bill outright. Before the elections, however, certain damaging factors had occurred on the international scene. The first was the coup in Nigeria in January 1966. Then on February 24th, Kwame Nkrumah, whom Albert Margai had extolled in his drive for the one-party system, was overthrown by his army while he was out of the country. It dawned on Albert Margai that every African leader stood the risk of being overthrown by a dissident army. On the evening of February 8, 1967, Albert Margai announced on national radio that an army plot to overthrow the government had been discovered. He blamed the attempted coup d'etat on the APC and its blatant incitements to military personnel. Albert Margai also revealed that he had made a pledge with the Guinea leader Sékou Touré to go to the aid of one another if requested in case attempts are made to overthrow the constitutional government by intervention of armed forces. Subsequently, the force commander, Brigadier David Lansana, ordered the arrest of the deputy force commander, Colonel John Amadou Bangura, and 7 other officers, all members of northern tribes or Creole, charging them with complicity in the alleged coup. 5 non-commissioned officers, likewise all northerners or Creole, were also arrested and detained after being linked indirectly with the alleged conspirators. The subsequent shake-up of the army command structure, southerners and easterners, mostly Mende, whose loyalty to the government seemed reasonably assured, monopolized all the company commands and presumably most of the platoon commands. Furthermore, soldiers from the north, presumably loyal to Colonel John Amadou Bangura, and the other ousted officers were placed under careful surveillance and, in some instances, disarmed. This set the context for the general elections, which were anticipated to be hotly contested. In early March 1967, preliminary investigations began with a view to determining whether the accused men should stand trial before a military tribunal or not. The investigations conducted under Albert Margai continued for a few weeks, and at one stage the SLPP Unity newspaper suggested that the government was contemplating bringing in judicial officers from Britain and other Commonwealth countries to conduct the trial of the accused. The matter of the coup suspects was, however, overshadowed by the preparation for the general elections. As the 1967 elections approached, Albert Margai became increasingly more desperate for power. He saw his chances of winning the elections of that year waning. So he embarked on further desperate and undemocratic moves. He dismissed the chief electoral commissioner and replaced him by a person who, he thought, was more amenable to his interest. He also caused the election deposits to be increased, with the hope that some opposition candidates would not be able to provide the increased deposits. This again was a miscalculation by him, as all of the opposition candidates paid their deposits in full. As part of the preparation for the election petitions, which were expected to follow the elections of 1967, Albert Margai caused the setting up of a special election petition court which would be responsible for trying cases arising from disputed electoral results. He recalled Gershon Collier, who was his strong ally, and appointed him Chief Justice. Gershon Collier was Sierra Leone's permanent representative at the United Nations at the time. The obvious intention was that any petition arising out of the ensuing election would be manipulated by the courts in his favor. On February 16, 1967, Parliament was dissolved and the government announced that the general elections would be conducted in 2 stages, that for the 66 ordinary members of Parliament would be held on March 17th and the one for paramount chiefs on March 21st. Political tension increased considerably during the campaign. The use of questionable electoral tactics was not limited to the SLPP government. The APC, for example, played on the ignorance of workers by charging that the introduction of the decimal system in the country's currency had been a devious ploy to enrich the ruling party's campaign coffers. APC propagandists also spread the rumor that the Queen in London had sent huge quantities of cotton cloth for free distribution to the women of Sierra Leone, but that the material had been embezzled by the SLPP women district leaders known as Mamie Queens. The APC sought to discredit the ruling party mainly on the grounds of tribalism, nepotism, and the corrupt financial practices of Albert Margai. When it came to awarding SLPP symbols to potential candidates to contest the elections of 1967 as SLPP candidates, Albert Margai refused to give symbols to 4 potential contenders. These 4 potential contenders were Kai Samba of Kenema Central, Prince Williams of Botown II, Luceni Brewa of Moyamba North, and J.B. Francis of Kenema. Each of those men was a prominent figure in his constituency and highly respected and popular, both in his constituency and within the SLPP circles. The 4 of them had been members of the House of Representatives up to the date of that election. Because of his disagreement with them, Albert Margai preferred to give the party symbols to persons who were less known and less popular in their respective constituencies, but who were his cronies. They became the official SLPP candidates for the 1967 election. Albert Margai supported them and put his full weight behind them during the campaign. Each of his preferred candidates lost the election woefully, and the other 4, to whom he refused to grant the party symbols, contested as independent candidates and won convincingly in their respective constituencies. In the provinces, meetings of district officers and other senior personnel of the Ministry of the Interior were guided as to the best way to secure an SLPP victory at the polls. The opposition voiced complaints that ballot papers were being distributed to SLPP agents to stuff the ballot boxes on polling day. The Public Order Act of 1965 was also used to restrict opposition meetings in the provinces. Under the provisions of the legislation, a public meeting defined as any gathering of 12 or more persons could only be held if the convener obtained prior authorization from the paramount chief of the chiefdom where the proposed gathering was to take place, whether or not the authorization was granted, and under what conditions necessary in the interests of defense, public order, public safety, or public morality was left entirely up to the paramount chief. By and large, the paramount chiefs took their cues from the government in Freetown and denied permission for APC and other opposition gatherings, or otherwise imposed onerous conditions upon the assemblies under penalty of imprisonment. 2 northern tribal leaders who nonetheless defied the Albert Margai government and authorized APC meetings, Chief Koblo Pathbana of Marampa Masimera and Chief Kande Luceni of Kamakwie, were deposed and exiled to the Pujehun district in the south. The now politicized army was brought to bear on the electoral process. For the first time in its post-independence history, the army was widely engaged in internal security duties, taking up visible positions not only in Freetown. Troops ostensibly dispatched to maintain security all over the country were really being used by the fading Albert Margai regime as a prop. It was alleged by a senior officer who fell out with the force commander Brigadier David Lansana just before the 1967 coup that ammunition was issued on a selective basis, mainly to Mende rank and file and to troops from ethnic groups who, because of proximity to Mendeland, could be adjudged to be pro-SLPP. The same partiality also featured in the choice of platoon or contingent commanders sent to the various key areas in the city and elsewhere. Some SLPP supporters did possess arms. At Blama in the eastern province, an army patrol vehicle was shot at by supporters of the ruling SLPP, who mistook it for an APC campaign vehicle because it had red markings, red being the APC color. The army patrol did not return the fire. On nomination day, February 27th, however, the SLPP secured 6 seats unopposed, including the Prime Minister's constituency, that of his brother Sam Margai, who represented a constituency in the Bont district, and those of his finance minister and the foreign minister. Following the announcement of the nomination results, APC sympathizers converged on the Electoral Commission's Freetown office to protest against the flimsy grounds on which their candidates' nominations had been invalidated. On March 3, 1967, a large crowd came face to face with armed troops and steel-helmeted riot policemen armed with tear gas, truncheons, and shields. The calling out of armed troops became the common reaction to disturbances in the period immediately before and after the general election. Objections to the unopposed return of an SLPP candidate in the Kono district in the Eastern Province led to clashes between rival party supporters. Albert Margai's reaction was to declare a state of emergency in the district on March 2nd. The next day, following the incidents at the Electoral Commission office in Freetown, the western area, Freetown and its surroundings, also came under the same proclamation. The election of ordinary members of parliament on March 17, 1967, was done under a state of emergency, which covered the entire country except the southern provincial district of Pujahun. The need to enforce the state of emergency brought the army to the forefront of national affairs, and from that moment the force commander Brigadier General David Lansana directed the country's political fortunes. Brigadier David Lansana's enhanced power was underlined by the fact that his residence, the Flagstaff House, had become the nerve center of political leadership. Some SLPP stalwarts even took up residence at the brigadier's residence as early as March 1st. By election day, soldiers were posted to man public buildings including the Sierra Leone Broadcasting Service, SLBS, studios, the transmitting site, the Electoral Commissioner's office and the Governor General's residence. Units from the army were also used to protect prominent SLPP candidates, especially in constituencies where they faced strong APC challenges. This led to an unprecedented deployment of soldiers throughout Sierra Leone, especially in the provinces, whereas previously, almost the entire corps was billeted at the Wilberforce Barracks in Freetown. As the results of the ordinary members of parliament came in, they were announced with a particular slant. The broadcasting service took care to always keep the SLPP in the lead, but even this attempt to deceive the public soon backfired, as there were other sources such as reports of foreign correspondence which proved to be more up-to-date than the official announcements. A clear example of official suppression of the verdict at the polls was the failure to announce the Moyamba West result, which was an APC win, because it was upsetting to the SLPP to be defeated in its own territory. Yet, there was every indication that the SLPP's power was slowly slipping away. So desperate was the situation that the party had to include the 4 successful independent candidates to the total number of seats it had gained, thereby giving the impression that it had broken even with the APC, which had won 32 of the 66 seats for ordinary members of parliament. The 4 successful independent candidates were the candidates that Albert Margai refused to give the party symbols. After the election, in spite of several pleas and entreaties, the 4 successful independent candidates refused to declare their support for the SLPP and for Albert Margai if Albert Margai did not resign from the leadership of the party, which of course they knew he would not do. Their refusal to declare for the SLPP gave the APC a majority of seats in the House of Representatives. That is, SLPP 28 seats as against 32 seats for the APC. The city of Freetown, which had given the APC maximum support, was agog with jubilant crowds. Some of these revelers, however, were accused of acts of provocation against defeated SLPP candidates. The latter and their supporters in certain cases asked for and got military protection. Many who lost their seats sought refuge at Brigadier General David Lansana's official residence. There were many of the SLPP faithful gathered there, and it was allegedly in the force commander's quarters that some top members of the SLPP decided, with the encouragement of Albert Margai, to prevent the APC's assumption of power. The Governor-General, Sir Henry Lightfoot Boston, a Creole barrister who had served the colonial government as a magistrate before becoming Speaker of the House of Representatives, and then, in 1962, the first native Sierra Leonean Governor-General, whose constitutional right it was to appoint a prime minister after a general election, had been led to believe that the 2 parties had won 32 seats each. When he invited both Albert Margai and Siaka Stevens to State House on March 20th, he advised them to consider the formation of a coalition government and report back to him 2 days later. Siaka Stevens wrote to the Governor-General explaining the impossibility of joining a coalition with Albert Margai and demonstrating how his party had emerged with the highest number of votes cast. Siaka Stevens' point was reinforced by a visit to the Governor-General by prominent Freetown citizens who were able to show the falsehood of the election results as given by the national radio. At that time also, some of the independent candidates whom the SLPP claimed had declared for the party informed the Governor-General that they had not done so. Others indicated their willingness to side with either party, except that in the case of the SLPP, Albert Margai should relinquish the leadership of the party. Thus, the Governor-General, bolstered by these considerations, decided that he would not reappoint Albert Margai as Prime Minister of Sierra Leone. According to the Constitution's stipulation that he should appoint as Prime Minister the man who seems likely to command the support of the majority of the members of Parliament, the Governor-General chose Siaka Stevens as the new head of government. Sierra Leone thus became the first post-colonial country in Africa, the apartheid regime in South Africa accepted, to effect a change of government through constitutional means after elections. Sierra Leoneans, however, were unable to hear the announcement of Siaka Stevens' appointment as Prime Minister. T.L. Decker, the permanent secretary in the Ministry of Information, instead of broadcasting the news, took the script to Brigadier David Lansana's residence at Wilberforce, where the force commander grabbed it and ordered, "You make no announcement." An hour after the swearing-in ceremony of Siaka Stevens and some of his cabinet ministers at State House on the afternoon of March 21st, they were put under house arrest by the Governor-General's own military aide-de-camp, Lieutenant Samuel Hinga Norman, who was acting on the orders of the force commander. At 5:55 p.m. on the same day, the force commander, Brigadier David Lansana, announced to the nation that he had declared martial law. Troops were then sent out to disperse the crowds who thronged around State House in readiness to celebrate the appointment of Siaka Stevens. Some members of the crowd, angered by David Lansana's intervention and fearing that the force commander wished to adbuck Siaka Stevens and his men, blocked the main roads throughout the city. The troops opened fire, causing many casualties. The next day, David Lansana spelled out the reasons for the army's decision to step in. He pointed out that the parties had obtained an equal number of seats and that the Governor-General had violated the Constitution by appointing a Prime Minister when, as he saw it, no party had a majority. In fact, the Governor-General should have waited for the results of the Paramount Chief's election, which was to be held on March 21st. David Lansana then gave his own interpretation of the 1961 Constitution. However, it must be said that Paramount Chiefs, who could be deposed by the central authorities, always supported the party that has majority seats in Parliament. In other words, they always supported the government of the day, and in 1967, they were not elected on a political party basis. Since David Lansana claimed that the army was not imposing a military government on the country, he began to settle the constitutional question. He called all newly elected members of Parliament to meet him in Freetown on March 22nd. At the same time, rumors were floating about that of the 12 Paramount Chief members elected, 10 had declared for the SLPP. Brigadier David Lansana was himself overthrown in a counter-military coup, led by Major Augustine Charles Blake, Major Sandy Bokari Jumu, and Major Bokari Idrisakai Samba on March 23, 1967. Brigadier David Lansana and Albert Margai were both arrested and detained, announcing the formation of a military government, the National Reformation Council (NRC). Major Blake specifically noted that he and his colleagues had noticed that the attitude of Brigadier David Lansana was not to bring about the creation of a national government, but to impose Albert Margai as Prime Minister on the nation, and had decided to disassociate themselves from the Brigadier's line of action and establish a military regime. Thus, Albert Margai's rule was brought to an end, and he became the first incumbent leader to lose an election in sub-Sahara Africa, excluding white-ruled South Africa and southern Rhodesia. The APC party was later restored to office after a counter-coup the following year and established a long-standing dictatorship. Albert Margai died on December 18, 1980 at age 70.